Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Good Orderly Direction, Practical Tools of the Bible. Today we are discussing Leviticus chapters 11 through 17, Basic Health and Safety Practices. I'm your host, Dr. Donnelly Snipes. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, and share in order to help the channel grow. It really helps us continue to put out new videos. Now, I found the set of chapters to be really interesting because you can read through them and see a scientific basis for why the laws were being put down. So we're going to talk a little bit about how these laws and rules really made sense from a modern perspective, even though they were issued way back in the BC period. Denial of certain foods may have been another example of teaching self-discipline, but in most cases, it also had very logical health and safety consequences. Some prohibited creatures may have been recognized as objects of worship by other cultures. Now, why would this be a health and safety practice? Well, you really don't want to go poking the bear. If this was something that was worshipped or revered by the cultures that were around you, how rude would it be to go, hey, this thing that you idolize, watch, we're going to eat it. So that probably wasn't a smart thing to do, which is why the prohibition was put out there. Let bygones be bygones. Let's respect, but not revere the beliefs of the people around us. Some prohibited creatures also had highly unsanitary habits like eating carrion or cecotrophy. Now, we go through and we see that vultures and stuff are prohibited. They eat carrion. Pigs eat just about anything. They're not picky. Rabbits are said in this chapter to be ruminants, but they're actually not ruminants. They just didn't have that knowledge back then. Rabbits are cecotrophs, which means they eat their poop, basically. There's a particular type of poop, if you will, called a cecotroph that they pass first thing in the morning that they have to eat, and it's essential to their GI functioning. But you can see where this would have been perceived as pretty disgusting to the ancient peoples. So they said, if it's going to eat its own poop, probably not going to be a healthy creature. Others may have been known to have rabies. There are incidences where they suspect that rabies was reported even back as early as 2300 BC. So creatures like skunks, for example, probably were prohibited, and foxes were probably prohibited because of the rabies. Additionally, I said that some of the other cultures that surrounded the Israelites idolized and worshipped various animals. So forbidden animals were often idols or perceived as unclean by other cultures. The Egyptians, we know, revered cats and big cats. So that was one of those that, okay, we're probably not going to, poke the bear, as I said. Dogs and wolves were idolized and revered by the Egyptians, but they were also carriers of rabies. So we don't know for what reason particularly they were prohibited, but we know they were prohibited. The Egyptians also revered crocodiles, monkeys, hippos, and the dung beetle or the scarab beetle. Now, the scarab beetle actually eats dung. It eats poop. And, that's great for recycling, not something you'd probably really want to eat yourself. And if you've been to the zoo, you know some of the behaviors of monkeys. So you can understand why some of these creatures may have been perceived to be unclean or evil in some way, or again, they were just worshipped by other cultures, and the Israelites were trying to be respectful. They weren't idolizing them, but they were respecting other people's belief systems, which is good boundaries. So Leviticus 11, verse 3, you may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews its cud. Okay, well, that's kind of weird. You put your Venn diagram together. They have hooves, they chew cuds, and, which ones have hoofs, divided hoofs, and chew their cud? Well, why was this prohibition put out? Creatures that chew their cud are herbivores or grass-fed, and chewing cud allows them to better digest their food. In the past 5, maybe 10 years, but definitely in the past 5 years, we've seen a resurgence of people recognizing how much more nutritious grass-fed beef is. So we're starting to recognize the benefits of cud chewing, I guess. Carnivores also kept the ecosystem in balance and weeded out the ill herbivores. So they didn't eat carnivores, in part maybe, because they were necessary in order to keep the deer population down, in order to keep the ecosystem in balance, in addition to the fact that because they ate other animals, they carried diseases that could be passed on to people. The pig is another example that was prohibited. It's an omnivore, but not a ruminant. Pigs, as I said, will eat just about anything. And we have that old saying, it's like you live in a pigsty. Pigs were perceived, even though they actually are very clean animals, they were perceived to be unclean. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. So back to your Venn diagram. All fish have fins, but not all fish have scales, like sharks, whales, and dolphin. Most fish you would be able to catch at that time were finned and scaled and likely not so big as to capsize a boat. And most, if not all, that were considered clean laid eggs instead of birthing live young. So that's another interesting aspect that we might consider. That the ancient people didn't want to take away a mama from the babies. Maybe that's just me imposing that, but whatever. Crustaceans are often found in deep water, so if they're on the beach, they may be ill or dead, with the exception of crabs, but we're going to get to those. Lobsters, a crustacean, scavenges for dead animals and debris on the ocean floor, and crabs apparently will also eat just about anything. They're like the vultures of the oceans. They are also an important source of food for larger clean fish like flounder and cod. So again, we see a prohibition of certain things, number one, because they're perceived as having some pretty nasty habits and potentially being pathogenic, but they're also an important niche in the ecosystem. Oysters, mussels, and scallops and clams are filter feeders and actually purify the water. They sit still and the water passes through their little filters. That's how they eat. And the stuff that they catch is what they digest. So they actually purify the water. Obviously, they have a purpose. And just to keep it simple, the prohibited birds are all known to eat carrion. This made them unclean, but also a very important part of a healthy ecosystem. So think back to the plagues when all of the frogs suddenly died and the stench just rose up to the heavens. It was important to have other creatures that were going to take care of all that mess. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat. Those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. You may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other flying insects that have 4 legs you are to regard as unclean. Now, some of this, in terms of using the word insect, comes from different translations of the Bible. However, while the Bible refers to them as insects, it says they only have 4 legs. And in our modern classification system, we know that insects have to have at least 6 legs. But if you look at the cricket, If you look at the locust, they have those two really big back legs that are jointed and used for hopping. And then they have four forelegs that probably appeared to be what they used for walking. So the four-legged reference made sense for them back in that time because they perceived the jumping legs as separate from the walking legs. Grasshoppers and locusts are also rich in protein and herbivores, so there's less chance that eating them will transmit diseases. Additionally, back to those plagues again, grasshoppers, locusts, cicadas, those all are animals that tend to swarm. And if they get out of control, can completely decimate the vegetative population, not only the food that people want to eat, but also the trees and everything else. So it was important to keep them under control. Anything that touches the carcass of an unclean animal or a dead animal, even if it's considered a clean animal, is unclean and must be washed and purified. Again, it makes sense. You touch a dead animal, even when we cook today, when we're in the kitchen, when we're cooking, we're handling meat if you eat meat. You don't just go to the table without washing your hands. You want to make sure you wash your hands and disinfect the cutting boards and make sure that everything is clean after handling meat because we know it carries pathogens. So moving on from food to childbirth, kind of a interesting segue, but there was a period of purification after childbirth. And to avoid getting too terribly graphic, after childbirth, obviously that is traumatic to the body. And there is a period of healing that is required. Now, the first 1 to 2 weeks after childbirth, the woman needed to be purified in order to allow her body to heal from the birthing process. The overt signs of the damage, the heavy bleeding and everything, the tears have started to knit back together at this point. So that is gone after the first 1 to 2 weeks for most people. But then there was this additional period of purification that for boys was 33 days and for girls was 66 days. During this period, many cultures expected the woman to stay home with the child. Go figure. The child's not sleeping through the night. The child's exhausted, or the mother's exhausted. She's, nursing the baby. Obviously, they didn't have formula back then. So during this period was a bonding time for mother and child. Although some scholars believe that after the first 2 weeks, conjugal duties of the woman may have begun again. So, it wasn't a complete rest period, but this was a period that allowed the woman to really focus on that newborn baby. Skin diseases are covered in the next 2 chapters. The priest is to examine people who have sores. If the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling skin disease and the person's unclean. If it's not more than skin deep, the person is quarantined for 7 days to make sure it doesn't become skin deep. The determination of the uncleanliness appears to be due to the wound being open or potentially oozing and contagious. So think of diseases like leprosy or smallpox. They didn't really understand a lot about the transmission at this point, but they understood that if there were significant changes in the skin, in the barrier, and, generally open wounds have a certain amount of ooze of some sort, that they may be contagious. Think about even something as simple as a water blister. If you get a blister, if that blister pops, it does have a certain amount of ooze. Sorry to be gross, but that's just the way it is. And the people at this point didn't recognize which ooze might be contagious and which might be healing and getting ready to form a scab. So it's like, okay, well, quarantine the person. Purification of skin diseases involved sprinkling the person with a tincture of hyssop and cedar wood. Both of these are antibacterial, antifungal, essential oils. So that's kind of cool that they were starting to understand how plants could help heal wounds and could clear or kill off any remaining bacteria. Shaving all the hair from their bodies and washing themselves and their clothes was also another step in the purification process. Thinking again, if the hair had turned white, remember that was one of the requirements for a defiling skin disease. If the hair had turned white, then, okay, so they may think that by looking at the hair, you can see the hair follicle, that might indicate that something was wrong with the hair, which transmitted a pathogen down into the skin. We don't know exactly what they were thinking back then, but by shaving off all the hair, you are eliminating those overt hairs that may have been transmitting disease, if that's what they thought. But it's also a way of eliminating all of the superficial anything where bacteria could hide. They were, smooth skinned and they were washed from head to toe. So there was a greater chance of disinfecting the entire person. And then they made a sin and guilt offering to God. Sometimes some of these diseases were autoimmune in nature. And we know when our immune system goes down, we are more susceptible to disease. So if they had done something that they had felt guilty for, then that might have exacerbated or made them more vulnerable to the pathogen. Or it could be as simple as the people at that point in time believed that God was punishing them. If they got a disease, if they got sick, it was a punishment from God for something. So they had to atone for whatever that was. Once they had purified themselves, then they could come back and atone. 13 and 14 chapters talk about defiling mold on fabric and in buildings. Who knew? Well, obviously they knew even back then that mold was bad. Mold and mildew are bad. So defiling mold on fabric should be washed and isolated. If it persists, then the fabric is to be burned. If you wash it and isolate it for 7 days and bring it back out and the mold has started to fade, the stain has started to fade, then it needs to be rewashed until the material is clean. If it hasn't faded, or worse yet, if it has continued to grow, then you got to destroy the cloth. You've got to destroy it so it doesn't transmit to anything else. Totally makes sense. They may not have realized at that point in time that mold made them sick, but it seems like it was pretty obvious on some level to them that mold was bad for their health. Defiling mold on buildings must be examined. The building is to be closed up for 7 days. If it persists, the building is torn down and the materials are taken away from the town. So you can't use the bricks, you can't use the plaster, you can't use that again because it was infected with that mold. So think, again, modern day, black mold. You're not going to take something that has been infested with black mold and, clean it up and use it again, most likely. I hope not. So they recognized that this particular growth was unhealthy. Additionally, they recognized anyone who enters the house with mold will be unclean until evening and must wash their clothes. So they recognized that spores could contaminate the clothing of someone and that the spores could get on them. So they had to wash and clean themselves. And then there was that period of purification until evening. Leviticus 15. This is another one that makes total sense. Bodily fluids. It's talking about discharges, and it lists a bunch of different discharges, which we're not going to get into deep depth on. But basically, it's what we talk about as bodily fluids today when we do blood-borne pathogen training. pus, semen, or blood, we know can all transmit disease. So what they were saying here is if a person is producing discharges from their body, it could carry disease. The person or article shall be washed and isolated for a period of time. So this, again, is another incubation period if you are contaminated by it, to see if the contamination actually is going to make you sick. Verse 31 says, you must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanliness. So they say it right here. All of these are for the health of the community. Leviticus 17, don't eat blood. Verse 14, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. This again, my interpretation is back in the day, the Israelites did not understand that if they ate the blood of an animal and they got sick, it wasn't the animal rebelling against them or causing them harm because the life that was in its blood was contaminating them. It was the bacteria that was within that animal's blood. But the point remains, don't eat the blood of the animal, because a lot of the pathogens are actually transmitted through the blood. There were no temperature thermometers back then to measure doneness. I mean, now we know that certain meats have to be cooked to an internal temperature of 150 degrees or better, and blah, blah, blah. I'm a vegetarian, so I don't know all those numbers. I may be a little off there. But it's important to recognize that they couldn't measure that. So it was safer just to say, don't do it. This is the beginning of ancient medicine. This is where we're starting to see how they recognize how herbs and essential oils can be used to heal, where we're seeing how they recognize the interconnectedness of things, how they're starting to see, oh, if I do this, then I'm likely to get sick. So let's say don't do that. They may not have understood what bacteria and fungi actually were, but they recognized the danger and learned ways through isolation, good hygiene, and disinfection practices to protect themselves. Although many don't follow all of these laws today, you can see how ancient people might have believed that engaging in these practices would anger God and cause them to be punished. So you can look back over these and you can see how if people did this, after they were prohibited from doing it, if they did this and they got sick, that it was a punishment from God. So, just interesting information. As I said, everything in the Bible can have a kernel of education in it. We just need to understand it with fresh eyes.